What does it mean to be a citizen of the United States?
To be a citizen of the United States, it means that you are guaranteed the rights that we have in the United States, and you also have certain responsibilities, like voting and stuff like that.
We have obligations to pay our taxes to keep the government running. We have obligations to keep our states functioning correctly.
A lot of freedom and the right to choose basically what's best for you and not have someone else choose what's best for you.
It means that you're part of the greatest nation in the world.
Being an American citizen is like being a member of a club. You've got rights and responsibilities. You don't get one without the other, and you can't take either for granted.
In our government, one that Abraham Lincoln described as of the people, by the people, and for the people are the very heart of the political system. That is why the most important people in the United States government are not the President, members of Congress, or the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, but we the people, citizens like you and me.
Give me liberty, or give me death.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
Okay, so if being a citizen of the United States is like being in a club, you're probably wondering what you have to do to become a member.
If you were born here, no sweat. You're in. In fact, that's how most folks become citizens. They're born on American soil.
For these purposes, that soil also includes Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands, the Northern Mariana Islands, any U.S. embassy, or even a U.S. public vessel.
I am an official, bona fide American citizen, and I have proof. It says so right here on my birth certificate. These things are good to have around if you want a passport or a government job.
While birth is the easiest way, it is certainly not the only way to acquire U.S. citizenship. If both of your parents are American citizens, and at least one of them has actually lived in the United States at some point, you too are an American citizen.
And even if just one of your parents is a U.S. citizen and has lived in the States for at least 5 years, and 2 of those years were after the age of 14,
then you're an American citizen too. But say you don't have an American mom or dad. Maybe you never even knew anybody in the United States. You can still become an American citizen.
A citizen of another country becomes a U.S. citizen through a process called naturalization. To become naturalized, a person has to live in the States for at least 5 years and speak English. He or she must be of good moral character.
Which basically means criminals need not apply.
And the applicant must be knowledgeable about American history and our form of government.
Speaks English? Check. A knowledge of American history? Check. Good moral character? Check.
The Constitution and laws of the United States of America.
Some of America's finest citizens were immigrants to this country, from political activists like Thomas Paine, the Englishman who helped spark the American Revolution,
and Czechoslovakian-born Madeleine Albright, our first female Secretary of State,
to scientists like German physicist Albert Einstein,
sports stars like Taekwondo master Jun Rhee of Korea, and basketball great Hakeem Olajuwon of Nigeria,
and artists like dancer Mikhail Baryshnikov and singer Gloria Estefan.
What drew them all here? The American rights that go along with American citizenship.
In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson wrote that all people are endowed with certain inalienable rights.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
The United States Constitution spells out the rights of American citizens in more specific detail. They can be broken down into 3 categories: personal rights,
like freedom of religion and freedom of expression,
Economic rights,
including the right to hold private property and the freedom to choose what kind of work you do,
and political rights.
like the right to hold public office.
Perhaps our most important political right is the right to vote, also known as suffrage.
Today, almost all adult citizens can vote, but at the time the U.S. Constitution was signed, suffrage covered very few people, only about 6% of the white men.
You wouldn't believe how long these attitudes lasted and how hard people had to work to change them. As late as 1842, white male property owners were still the only people allowed to vote in Rhode Island. It took a big rebellion led by Thomas Dorr to convince the folks in power that even poor men should have a say in their government.
Black men were awarded suffrage in 1870 when the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was passed.
Yeah, they got the award, but they couldn't pick up the prize. Many states found ways to prevent African Americans from voting.
The Board of Registrars is not in session this afternoon, as you were informed beforehand. You came down to make a mockery out of the courthouse, and we're not going to have it.
You cannot beat down justice, and we will register to vote because as citizens of these United States, we have the right to do it.
Until the Civil Rights Movement forced Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, most Southern blacks had never seen the inside of a voting booth.
The Voting Rights Act radically changed the country's attitude on race, but also on gender, and on freedom in general. Frederick Douglass said at the turn of the century that the struggle for freedom in America is the struggle to save black men's bodies and white men's souls. In many respects, we saw the Voting Rights Act as carrying that out.
Rich men, poor men, black men. They all got the vote. But what about the women? Didn't they deserve a voice too?
Susan B. Anthony was one of many courageous Americans who demanded women's suffrage.
You have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights are all alike ignored. Robbed of the fundamental privilege of citizenship, I am degraded from the status of a citizen to that of a subject. And not only myself individually, but all of my sex are doomed to political subjection under this so-called form of government.
But most of the early feminists who fought so hard for the vote never got to cast one.
1920. After a 72-year struggle for women's suffrage, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is finally passed. It states that the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied on the basis of sex. All over America, supporters of women's rights rejoice.
Are you a voter yet? Well, if not, you will be very soon. Because in 1971, the 26th Amendment to the Constitution lowered the voting age to 18.
The amendment was in direct response to protests about the Vietnam War. The youth of America asked, if we're old enough to fight, why aren't we old enough to vote?
Right on. Unfortunately, having the right to vote is not the same thing as actually voting. And that's how it is for a lot of people our age. We could vote, but we don't.
For instance, in the 1996 presidential election, only 25% of Americans in the 18 to 24-year-old age group voted.
Whoa, that's weak.
Especially when you compare it to the 66% of senior citizens who did vote in the same election.
When I was campaigning in my first race for Congress, I realized that the people who were most likely to vote were going to be the elderly. If two people came out of a store at the same time, and I could only speak to one of them, who was I going to speak with? I went to the elderly person. That was a conscious decision. I made sure that I was interacting with them more because they, frankly, were more likely to vote.
By the time you get 65, you know how important government is, and you know that you need Social Security. You need Medicaid. You need tax exemption in order to live out your senior years. And so you vote because you know that everything in your life depends on it. Well, voting is no less important for young people, and so the sooner they assume the responsibilities of their freedom, the better they will be represented by their government.
No wonder politicians spend so much time focused on issues that are important to my grandparents, like prescription drugs and Social Security, instead of things my friends think are important, like the environment and good jobs. When you get the vote, use it. It's your duty as an American citizen, so take responsibility for your rights.
You must defend your own rights or risk that they be taken away from you.
The rights and responsibilities of United States citizenship are closely linked, like two halves of the same coin. Some of those links are even legally binding.
Service on a jury is probably one of the greatest contributions you can make to our judicial system. Now, I've had a lot of people come in my court and say, oh, I have other things I'd rather be doing, and do I have to sit here and listen to this trial? And I only wished for those people they could understand how important they are and how an integral part they are to our system.
Responsibilities of citizens certainly entail, at the most basic level, a willingness to abide by the laws of the land, to pay one's taxes, to answer the call for military service. But more than that, it entails recognizing the rights of others to express their views, and finally, the responsibility of participation in the broader political process of, at the simplest level, voting and becoming informed enough to cast an intelligent ballot.
Voting is not a legal responsibility. The government doesn't force you to do it. But why wouldn't you want to vote? As a citizen, it's in your best interest.
If you want to make a difference, if you want to be a part of the selection process of choosing who's going to represent you and the kind of agenda you want to see for your country, then if you stay in the bleachers and just watch what happens on the playing field, then you really can't complain about the results. But if you decide you want to be involved in that decision, the simplest, most direct thing you can do is to register to vote and exercise that right that very few people around the world have today, and that is to choose the people who will represent you.
Hey, the responsibility doesn't begin and end at the voting booth. Before you vote, you've got to get educated. What are the issues that you care about? Read up on them. Form an opinion. Which candidates agree with you? And which ones do you trust the most? And in between elections, put your ideas into action. There's a million ways that you can be a responsible citizen.
One way is to directly participate in government.
In addition to voting, I would ask everybody to think about running for office. Because while it's exciting to vote, there's no question that serving your community in one capacity or another really makes you feel good. It gives you a very warm feeling because you're giving something back.
If you're truly interested in maybe trying to make this world a better place in which to live, public service is a place where you can achieve great things by working with others to really improve the quality of life.
Of course, running for office isn't for everyone. Maybe you express yourself better one-on-one. Your representatives in City Hall, at the State House, and in Washington, D.C. want to hear your ideas. How else would they find out which policies are important to you? So reach out and touch somebody. Use that phone, or fax, or email, or write a good old-fashioned letter.
It's essential that we try to understand what our constituency, the people we represent, are thinking. And we do that through a variety of means. One is just the letters they write us. Just one letter can trigger us to do the research into that issue and forces my staff to understand it and then forces me to understand it in order to us responding to that individual.
And that's the way politics is supposed to work. I always thought that I was sitting in the chair of the congressman, but it didn't belong to me. It belonged to the 500,000 people whom I represented. And what I was supposed to do is see to it that they got their fair share in a democracy.
Hello? Hello? My representative doesn't seem to be getting my message. Does that stop a good citizen? Ha! A minor roadblock. I can write a letter to the editor of the local newspaper or contact the news directors of the local radio and TV stations. Or I can take it to the streets. I can make like a protester in the Vietnam War, or the million moms who marched against gun violence in Washington.
The idea of civil disobedience is that one openly challenges laws that you consider unjust or unfair. And it's important that you do it openly, and that you do it without violence and without enmity. And our Constitution gives us that right. In fact, it almost demands that we continue to explore the potential of freedom as not something that's static and that was decided once and for all, but something that is constantly growing and being fulfilled in the lives of our citizens.
You could even follow the example of one of the greatest organizers of them all, Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez learned the meaning of social inequality very early on. When he was only 10, economic hardship forced his family to leave their home in Arizona and head for California. There they joined hundreds of thousands of migrant workers who harvested crops from one farm to the next.
In the middle of the 20th century, this kind of work was hardly better than slave labor. Not only was the pay lousy, but the migrants lived in dirty, overcrowded housing, often without electricity or running water.
In 1962, Chavez began organizing farm workers, eventually founding the United Farm Workers of America, or the UFW. Together, they demanded fair pay and better working conditions. When the growers refused, the union went on strike in 1965. It would prove to be a long, bitter battle. Chavez called on the public to stop buying California grapes to show their support. In 1978, many of the UFW's demands were finally met, ending the boycott, but not Cesar Chavez's work. Until his death, he continued to speak out for farm workers. Cesar Chavez, an American original. Self-discipline and keeping promises are two of the hallmarks of a good citizen.
Respect is another, and that goes for both the people you agree with and the people that you don't.
After all, the rights of free speech extend to everyone. As the French philosopher Voltaire reportedly said, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it."
When I think good citizens, I think patriots. People who care as much about their community and country as they do about themselves.
Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was such a person. Before her, first ladies generally stayed behind the scenes of the White House, but Mrs. Roosevelt used her position to be a powerful advocate for social change.
She championed civil rights for blacks and women, and during World War II, she traveled all over the world on behalf of her husband to encourage American soldiers.
After President Roosevelt's death, she continued to serve the country. As one of the first U.S. delegates to the United Nations, she helped author the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
You can gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face. You must do the thing which you think you cannot do.
Eleanor Roosevelt encouraged Americans to keep up the good fight during some of our darkest moments.
Her patriotism inspired a nation.
So what do you do to give back to your community?
What I give back to my community is my service in the United States military. Not only do I give back to my community, but to the nation.
I teach literacy. I work in a foundation that's dedicated to promoting democracy and human rights throughout the world. I vote.
I volunteer at libraries. I'm a school teacher, so I stay after school with my children, tutor them.
I do a lot of volunteer work in the community, feeding the homeless, setting up AIDS walks, and all sorts of different charity events.
It's so important that those of us who have more than others give back, that we volunteer, that we give of our time, of our talents, and our service to those who maybe who don't have as much as we do. And the reason why it's good is because, well, I think it's part of being a good citizen. And second, it makes people who receive what you have to give feel so good. And at the same time, it makes those who give, who are volunteering, and I can tell you this from my own experience, it makes you feel so good that you're doing something for someone else.
Here are some tips about being an effective volunteer.
Choose something that reflects your interests.
Say you love to read, then get involved with tutoring little kids. If you love to skateboard, volunteer to work at the summer rec program.
Set your time commitment.
Hey, everybody's busy. Figure out how much time you really have to give and then stick to it.
It means giving something back. It means deciding maybe to become a Peace Corps volunteer, becoming a VISTA volunteer, working with your church or synagogue, working with the Board of Education, being a big brother or a big sister.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Across the decades, President Kennedy's words still ring true. What do you love about America? What really bugs you? And what are you going to do about it?
The rights and responsibilities of citizenship are in your hands.
So don't take them for granted, because you have the power. That ballot, that pen, that picket line make you the most important person in the country, a citizen of the United States of America.